This is a production of Cornell University.
You hear me? It's working. Well, I want to thank all the graduate students for putting this on and Corteva as well. It's been fun for me so far. I think I was placed appropriately in the order of speakers. I've learned a lot just listening before my presentation. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about the Land Institute where I work. It's an institute that's founded about 40 years ago with a certain set of uncommon problems or uncommon goals in mind. And I'd like to begin with a quote from the founder of the Institute, Wes Jackson. And Wes says that it's impossible for us to operate in our daily lives and not create the world that everyone must live in. What we desire arranges the genetic code in all of our major crops and livestock. We cannot avoid participating in the creation, and it is in agriculture, far and away, our largest and most basic artifact that human culture and the creation totally interpenetrate. And this is very real, very obvious as we look at how humans have changed the landscape of the world today. If we look, in the mountains of China where we have paddy rice systems and terraces, or Gray County, Kansas, the Kansas-Nebraska irrigated agriculture areas, or places like I was in January, Taipei, Palestine, where through agriculture over thousands of years, we've eroded away the soil that was there to a point where not only can we not do agriculture here anymore, but the ecosystems that preceded them, the oak savannas that were there before, cannot reestablish even after hundreds of years. And so what we've done through domestication and the technologies that we've developed to create the agriculture that we have today is fairly amazing. And if we look at a map of the amount of the human appropriation of net primary productivity around the world, we see that many of the areas we think of as being very productive, we're appropriating up between 60 and 80% of the biomass, the net primary productivity that would have been there before agriculture. So we're in the 80% range of the ecosystems that we're replacing them with. And that's pretty amazing when we think about what the crops that we've domesticated started as. But the way that we're growing those crops has problems. So if we think about how our crops are grown, they're grown in these systems that require continual disturbance. They're kept at a ecosystem level that's early in the successional gradient, right? So we never allow ourselves to develop these systems to retain nutrients, and as a result, we have leaky agroecosystems. And so we see that in our cropping systems, we have losses of biodiversity from those landscapes and those systems. We have losses of soil resources from those systems. And we continue to lose nutrients through volatilization, through leaching, through runoff, and et cetera. And this is ultimately inefficient, right? This is keeping our net primary productivity down, and to maintain the net primary productivity of those systems, we have to supplement those ecosystems with continuous inputs. So just to look at biodiversity loss, this is a map of the United States showing the counties in the U.S. Every county that has a color, at least 20% of the cropland in that county is devoted to crop production. And we look around at big portions of the U.S. We have a small effective crop number, meaning on 20% of the landscape, there's maybe only 3, 4, maybe only 1 or 2 species that are making up, that are taking up the surface area of that landscape. I'm from Nebraska. My family farms in York County, Nebraska, and this is very interesting to me. Somehow there's 3 to 4 effective crop species on the landscape, but out of the 366,000 acres that are there, 84% of them are devoted to crop production. And 82.5% are devoted to just 2 crops, corn and soybean production. And we think about, okay, what's happening on those other 16% of the acres? Well, there's a couple of towns, there's a lot of roads, we have a golf course, there's a few parks, and that's about it. And I think it's really easy for us to be desensitized to those environments. That's normal for me. And I was talking with some of the other speakers. I flew into Detroit on my commute here, and I always look out the window and I see an 80 here and I see a quarter section here. And it's normally, perfect grid, square, flat map. And it was really interesting flying into Michigan where, you still see the sections, but there was like the back 40 or a 20 that was devoted to timber still. It was something that was a part of that culture, I guess, that was there before. That's not a part of mine. I haven't seen something like that in where I'm from. The other thing that is really important to remember is that we're losing a lot of soil from our agroecosystems. When we look at a natural ecosystem, there is soil formation, right? We have pedogenesis, and we're building soil through rock weathering really, really slow, thousands of a millimeter per year. We're developing new technologies and new techniques to do agriculture better, and one of those is no-till agriculture. But we're still having net losses of soil on an annual basis. And a small percentage of our agriculture is devoted to no-till. We have about 5% no-till in the US right now. The majority of the agriculture is still plowed. We're losing up to 1.5 millimeters of soil per year from those landscapes. And if we think about what does sustainability mean, we don't have soil left to do agriculture. Where's that food going to come from? So we can look at soil losses around the world. In 2012, most of our most productive areas are still losing enormous amounts of soil. Look at here's the Iowa, Illinois region. We're losing 5 to 10 metric tons per hectare of soil. Think about the volume of soil that is, and where is it going, right? The other thing that we've lost from most of the soils is the organic matter that was there. We lose it as CO2 through respiration and oxidation of the soil organic content. And so this is a map. I farm a little bit with my cousin-in-law in Kansas now, and this is a map of one of our fields. And you can see here really clearly, so my cousin-in-law took the field over about 8 years ago. All the stuff that's yellow and green, this was native pastures. It hadn't been tilled in anyone that could remember his lifetime. And so we have soil organic levels that are in the 3s, 4s, 5s, and even 6s. These areas that are red, those have been farmed continuously for the last unknown number of decades. And this is pretty typical when we look around the world. Just 30, 40 years of tillage, we reduce the soil organic matter that was there by 30%, up to 50 or 60%, depending where we are at. The soil organic matter is very important, right? That's our nutrient storage system. That's how we store the water that our crops need. That's how we store the nitrogen that our crops need. That's where the phosphorus is. That's where everything is. And when we lose that, when we have sand, it's even more important for us to continue adding inputs to the system every year to maintain the fertility and the productivity of those systems. Not to mention the CO2 that we're losing, right? Some of that CO2 that's in the organic matter is old net primary productivity from how many years ago we're unsure. And so the other thing that we lose often is our nitrogen and our phosphorus losses. So most of our phosphorus losses, right, that's imported phosphorus. That's animal manure, that's rock phosphate that's mined from around the world. And nitrogen is the same way. We know that this has major consequences, and these aren't just some unique outcome of agriculture. These are predictable consequences of an agriculture practice in the way that we're doing it by keeping our agroecosystems at this early stage of secondary succession. And so now we have hypoxic areas around the world, dead zones around the world. We have, the largest dead zone in the world is here, 20,000 hectares annually in size. And we're not doing that much to address this issue. We're projected that we're going to continue increasing our nitrogen inputs annually. 2% of the world's energy every year goes to creating synthetic nitrogen. It's a huge reason why we're all here, is because of that unique invention. But we have not really improved our nitrogen use efficiency very much. In the US, now we're in the 60% range. But globally, our global average is about 42% nitrogen use efficiency. So 1% of the world's energy is creating nitrogen that's not used. It's running off and leaving the system elsewhere as nitrous oxide emissions, a potent greenhouse gas, or as nitrate leaching into groundwater supplies or runoff into our marine ecosystems. So really, as a consequence of agriculture and human activity in general, we're beginning to cross these planetary boundaries. Humans are now, the biggest determining factor of climate and environmental effects that's a unique time in history, that one species is controlling so many things. And so if we look at what kind of boundaries we've already crossed, we've already crossed about 4. We know that our climate is increasing at a rate that we have uncertainty about what the risks of that are going to be. Some things like genetic diversity loss and land system change from a forest ecosystem that's holding the carbon in place and the nutrients in place to our cropping system. We've also crossed these boundaries. And what's very interesting to me, we've really disrupted these biogeochemical flows through our nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer inputs. And we have UN agencies and international agreements about things like climate change and what temperatures we want to be at, but we haven't really addressed this issue. We don't have an international agency or a set agreed upon, levels of inputs. We're just continuing to project. We haven't really used nitrogen on the whole African continent, and that's a place where we imagine. Right now, they're in the 80s for nitrogen use efficiency, but as soon as they begin really applying it, we imagine that the efficiency is going to go way down. And so, when we talk about, common plants for uncommon goals. So uncommon goals of plant breeding, of our plant science, of our research, these are still pretty uncommon goals, and we're at a time in history where they need to become our common goals. All of us need to be thinking about things. As a graduate student, where is your crop going? What soil type is it grown on? What's the vulnerability of that soil? What do we have to do to maintain the fertility of those soils? I think it's very important for us to consider in the future. And more importantly, how are we going to address these issues? What can we change in our crops? And so the Land Institute, Wes Jackson, once again, this is what he says. So since nature has the most sustainable ecosystem, and since ultimately agriculture comes out of nature, our standard for a sustainable world should be nature's own ecosystem. So let's look at some ecosystems that have reached this, later term secondary succession where we have proper earth systems. We have the nitrogen cycle that's functioning. We're retaining nutrients in the system. And what do we notice about those? Whether it's the prairie, whether it's a tropical rainforest or a savanna, or even coastal wetlands and taigas and tundras, all of these ecosystems are composed of, really noticeable things. One, they all are predominantly made of perennial species, perennial plant species. And two, it's never just a single species. There's some species might be more dominant in the ecosystem than others, but there's always diversity in those systems. So this is becoming the goal of our organization. When we look at a natural ecosystem, right, because we're perennial in high diversity, we have soil formation happening. We have increased soil organic matter. We're retaining nutrients in the system. We have a habitat that allows for a functional soil microbiome to develop. And we actually have water infiltration. We don't have rock like in Palestine where the water just lands on the rock and runs down the hill. We're using the nutrients that are landing on that landscape. And we look at our current agroecosystems, they're characterized by annuals, crops, low diversity. We have soil erosion. We have reductions in soil organic matter. We have nutrient losses. We don't have functioning soil microbiomes. We have poor water infiltration in a lot of landscapes. And so we're trying to envision a new, what we call natural systems agriculture that's not natural, it's still engineered, it's still humans. We are still the ones that are affecting the climate and the environment, right, by designing these systems. But they're composed of perennial crop species. They have moderate diversity. And we envision them as actually allowing soil formation to happen, having increased soil organic matter, retaining nutrients, having functional soil microbiomes, and infiltrating the water that's landing on them. And so, what are some of the reasons that maybe these later successional ecosystems are functioning? And one, we can see that we actually probably have increased net primary productivity. This is a field in Kansas. This is a field that's been fallow. It's about to be planted to sunflowers. The same time of the year, this is one of our researchers' field at the Land Institute. This is Silphium, which is a perennial relative of sunflower in the Asteraceae family. And you can see it's big and growing. And so when we have living root systems, they're going to begin growing, doing photosynthesis as soon as the environmental conditions are appropriate to do so. As soon as we have warm enough temperatures in the spring, they're going to be actively growing. And hopefully someday as a whole, we can see that instead of taking away most of the net primary productivity as seed from the system, we have a larger pool of net primary productivity to begin from, and we can still take large yields of seed away, leaving some of the net primary productivity there to feed the soils and to build the organic matter and those other ecosystems that we need for functional soil microbiomes. It's your guys' turn. So we also can see that perenniality can increase the soil organic carbon. When we look at temperate grasslands, perennial species are there, and in general, perennials have a 40 to 60% below ground allocation of their net primary productivity. And so a lot of the organic material that's landing on the landscape is actually going into living roots in the soil. In our annual grains, we only have 15 to 20% below ground allocation of net primary productivity, and it's turning over each year. And so this is the vision of the Land Institute, right? Like this is an uncommon goal, but one that we know is possible. This at the top is intermediate wheatgrass species that we've been domesticating with other people around the world for quite a few years. And on the bottom is our annual wheat. And you can see the differences in the net primary productivity of the system. And the amount of organic matter, of carbon that's entering the soil each year in those root systems. So this is really the vision of the future, You guys can stay in there as long as you want. Thank you very much, appreciate it. And in addition to bringing carbon into the systems, these large living root systems, accomplish multiple other goals. When grown on slopes, they can limit water erosion. We're covering the soil and holding the soil all year, every year. And we can also, limit our water contamination. So the water that's there is being infiltrated. We have large living root systems that are going to be uptaking all of the nitrate that's in our soil and preventing runoff into our streams. So instead of planting, buffer strips in and around our fields, we have field scale buffer strips, and it's something that I hope that we can envision and dream of. Resource partitioning in diverse systems. So when we look at a diverse system, we have, biomass, and we have root organs and plant organs of all different shapes and sizes. And some of them are big taproots reaching deep in the soil, and we have, fibrous root systems that are putting a lot of matter into the top of the soil. And we really have this partitioning, this niche partitioning that happens in a secondary, later term successional ecosystem. So we're capturing nutrients and holding them in place at all levels of the soil profile. We're capturing sunlight and water at all levels of what's coming into the system. And so, we can imagine, even with perennial grains, right? If we have a perennial cereal rye species, we have some ecosystem services that we're accomplishing. We're holding the soil in place. We're providing continuous living roots there that are creating habitat for things possibly like AMF fungi and other soil microorganisms. As we add new species like alfalfa to this mixture, we have another additional ecosystem service that we can apply. We have these nodules providing habitat for nitrogen fixing rhizobia species. And ultimately, we're bringing nitrogen into the system to facilitate the growth and development of our soil organic nitrogen pool and other plants and organisms in the system. And finally, you can imagine that we add maybe a third species, a perennial sunflower type of relative, that in addition to growing additional biomass and using the resources there is also providing habitat for beneficial insects, for pest control, and habitat for other wildlife in our systems. And ultimately, we have this gradient of soil health that is improved through this process. And so these are really the uncommon goals of our institute. We're working to develop perennial grain crops through domestication. So this species, intermediate wheatgrass here, is a perennial wild relative of wheat, and we have a direct domestication program for that crop, or through wide hybridization. So we have multiple other programs. We're looking at other common annual grain crops that we're trying to use wide hybridization to bring perenniality into those species. And finally, in addition, we're trying to deploy these grains in diverse crop assemblies on agricultural landscapes. And so in addition to the Land Institute, we have collaborators all around the world that are interested in working on these same crops and cropping systems with us. And it's really increasing quickly. We have a perennial rice breeding program and researchers that we're working on that have developed perennial rice varieties that are planted on thousands of hectares already and have been almost equally as productive as the annual rice varieties grown in those same regions. 6 harvests in a row, three years, two retuning events. And so perennial legume breeding, that's what I do. The Land Institute hired me in 2016 to pursue a new position as a perennial legume breeder, and it was pretty appropriate. So 2016 was the International Year of the Pulses, the FAO's year, and the year before was the International Year of the Soils. And so we recognized the importance of pulses and legumes in this idea of what a sustainable future agriculture could look like. It was very interesting. I really enjoyed Allison's talk today. And I think, looking into the future, the one thing that we're missing still is the nitrogen cycle. We need sustainable inputs of nitrogen into our system, and legumes are one way that we can do that. Especially a perennial, you accomplish, this developing a long-term root system, and you're slowly releasing nitrogen into the soil. That's becoming part of the soil organic nitrogen pool. We also know, for example, we'll just keep talking here. So I was hired in 2016 without a species or a crop or even a vision of exactly how the perennial legumes were going to fit into the system. And so that was interesting. And so I started at late fall 2016, and I remember kind of sitting in my office with a set of questions that are still the same questions that I'm asking today. And, so the first question is, what legumes are perennials? Which legumes are there and that I can work with? The next question was, which species should I choose? How many are there and which one can I work on? The next question, Larry's presentation was really nice. How do we develop an idiotype for whatever species we're working on? And, eventually as a breeder, how do I develop a breeding program for that crop? So which legumes are perennial? I actually began working in a collaborative project while I was still at the University of Wisconsin as a graduate student, a couple of months before I started the position, with Dr. Allison Miller through this perennial agriculture project, Global Inventory. And so we wanted to build an inventory of all the legume species and look at their life histories. So there was no nice list of what are the taxa in the Fabaceae family, and which ones are annuals and which ones are perennials, and what type of perennial they are. And so we had this idea that we want to have perennial herbaceous legumes. They fit into our sort of envisioned cropping system of things that are growing back every year. So out of 20,000 some species, about 30% were perennial herbs, the kind that we're interested in, 4,800. And so, now I had my list of which ones are perennials, but we still have to decide which species to choose. So there's a large number. And what's really interesting to me, so there's 20,000 some species in the Fabaceae family. As humans, we use maybe 15 as foods that we eat, and maybe another 30 to 40 as ones that we use as forage crops. And so there's this whole broad amount of diversity that in some instances we're at risk of losing, and that we don't really know that much about. Did we choose those 15 because those were the obvious candidates to people 10,000 years ago when they started domesticating plants around the world? Or did it just kind of happen? Was there just that one unique person who saw that plant and was used to eating that plant and thought, oh, I'm going to try planting the seeds one time, and then it just kind of went from there. And so now it's at this, which species should we choose? And so that was the next question that I focused on kind of my first few months at the Land Institute, and really developing this idea of, what do we want in a crop? And so, some basic concepts. We care about its agronomic potential. Can we establish it? What are the field management strategies that I need? Is it harvestable? What's the yield potential? Is it adaptable? Can it be only grown in a specific, location in the world, or can it be grown all over the place? What are some of the seed quality attributes? What's its nutritional profile? Does it have any anti-nutritional compounds in it? Can it be used like CBD in some high value product? Seems like a quick way to commercialize a new species. And then, very importantly, what are the ecosystem services that this species could provide? How does it require resources? How does it retain resources? Does it provide other provisions for other purposes? Is it dual use? Can it be used as a fiber and a seed crop? Um, and finally, wanted to think about the ease of breeding. So we know that um, things like ploidy level and genome size are really going to be an important criteria long term, and how successful we're going to be, and also this availability of genetic resources. And so, when you're a new scientist and you want to start doing something your first year, um, availability of germplasm and genetic resources, and then really thinking about what's the quickest way that I can release something that's useful in agriculture. Dual use became kind of the most important criteria for me right now. We're still evaluating many other native and wild species that haven't been used before, but moving forward with these ideas. And so when we think about what perennial legume species are being used right now, well, we have many common perennial forages, especially alfalfa. Alfalfa is probably the perennial herbaceous species that's had the most genetic research, agronomic research in the whole. We grow it everywhere. So we've really been looking hard at these perennial forage. There's people that I can collaborate that know something about these crops. There's seed available for me. It really makes sense to start with those species. And so we're looking at them as perennial companion legumes, something that we can interplant between rows of other annual or perennial grain species as our nitrogen input source. And then also as kind of the perennial grain, perennial pulse idea. Can we harvest something that's edible that can be used as a new pulse crop? And so that was sort of the beginning of my how do we develop an idiotype. And my first year, I just kind of ran with it, right? Well, probably we want big seed. So alfalfa is a great example of a crop with really good potential. We have a whole seed industry that's already existing to produce seed for farmers. We grow a lot of it in the Western United States, and they're sometimes achieving yields, 600, 800,000 pounds an acre without really breeding for those characteristics. And those are pretty comparable to the lentil yields that are in the same environment, grown in very similar ways. And so, I think at first naively, I was thinking, well, we need to have bigger seeds for sure because people aren't going to want to eat really small lentils. Um, and also, thinking about long term, seed establishment of forage legumes is pretty hard. We have to either till a lot and have really firm seed beds and plant very shallowly, which is the same as with hemp. It's a big challenge, and so we didn't want tillage to be part of our long-term cropping system. And we also can't have that much residue on the surface of the soil because the seeds are small and can't push up through them. And so I was hoping that increasing seed size will help with establishment as well. And so we did a little bit of work. I started with this germplasm called Alborea. Dr. Edwin Bingham had worked on it at the University of Wisconsin for a long time. And it's an alfalfa wide hybrid with Medicago arborea, which is a woody perennial shrub from the Mediterranean. It has seed size that are quite a bit larger than conventional alfalfa. And so one cycle of selection, we saw some interesting things. Out of my half-sib families, I had families that were really outperforming the alfalfa checks in the experiment. And as this is just data from the USDA GRIN system. But if we look at the two subspecies of Medicago sativa compared to all of my breeding populations as a whole, we are actually shifting the seed size of alfalfa in some way closer towards this other species natural seed size. Another crop that I'm really interested in is sainfoin. It's another perennial forage legume that has a long history. It's pretty fascinating in that when we look at archaeological evidence, humans were eating this at one point in time. So there's caves in Turkey and around that area where we're finding charred remains of these seeds now. And there's been some recent interest in actually using it as a seed crop, a grain crop already. So there's been a few studies in Italy and in Europe where organic protein sources are really in need and really expensive. And so they've been actually looking at these seeds as a possible protein delivery system. And feeding trials with pigs and chickens and other monogastrics like mice. In general, we haven't seen any negative consequences. There's been good rates of gain that are comparable to soybean meal. And it seems like there's a lot of promise. It also has, when we think about idiotypes, I think lupins kind of encapsulate what I imagine the morphology of a new perennial grain would look like. They have this beautiful terminal raceme that has all these nice little flowers on it. You can imagine being skimmed off easily with a combine. And we expect this to be one of the big problems with domesticating perennial forbs in general, is that they don't really have this nice determinate growth pattern and then senescence pattern that we can think of in our annuals. They dry down sort of naturally on their own and are easily harvested with the combine. So, maybe in a system like this where we have dry seed pods up above, we can use a stripper header on the combine and come through and just skim them off the top. And if you've never seen a lupin pod, they're super interesting. They look pretty much like a soybean pod. So they look like a stem of soybeans with pods all the way up, 3 or 4 seeds in a pod and pretty good size. We have 3 other species of lupins that have already been domesticated, annuals, that are grown around the world. Actually, one of the species that was domesticated by the Incas in South America, its progenitor is actually a perennial species. And so there's a lot of opportunities to explore that in more detail. We can cross it with the native species, Lupinus polyphyllus, that I'm interested in. So this is the ornamental lupin that you see planted in people's flower beds. There's been breeding already for these, increased reproductive output. So it's an interesting one for me. And so, I started this second round of, okay, how do we develop an idiotype? And this was really began when I started thinking about companion legumes and how do you breed for something that you're going to plant between rows of something else. If your phenotype is actually, the expression of a phenotype in a different crop, how do you select for that interaction, and what sort of breeding system do you use? And so we have people have been trying this for quite a while. One of the species I'm working on is cura clover, and we've tried using it as kind of this living continuous cover mulch system, especially in Wisconsin. Ken Albrecht worked on it a lot in Wisconsin. Craig Schaefer's worked on it in the University of Minnesota. And we've tried all sorts of ways of trying to kind of manage the compatibility and the competition in that system, but no one has taken a breeding approach. So no one has really gone through it. Is there a way that we can select to change these systems? And so, I began to think about really in detail. So what is our cropping system? What's the row spacing going to be? What are we planting in between? What are the limitations of a candidate species in that system? So a lot of these new species that we try, I'm getting wild seed sent from either I buy them from native seed nurseries, or there's like these wild seed collection networks where you email this person and they mail you some seed back. I collected this in this place. And so we have terrible germination rates. Usually there's a lot of outbreeding depression and genetic load that's there. And it's hard to evaluate these things in plots even because, they're hard to compare. Which traits are components of seed yield? So even like in the Lupinus polyphyllus seed yield study, we don't really know, should I be selecting for more seeds per pod? Should I be selecting for more flowers on a raceme? And which traits are increasing the compatibility of my legume in my mixtures? And finally, for these mixtures, can I breed plants in monoculture stands or in space plant nurseries? Or do I have to do my breeding in between rows of the companion that they're going to be grown with? So one of the projects we started last year was our first year of phenotyping with a technician and master student in my lab, is really trying to design these intermediate wheatgrass alfalfa biocultures. And so we began a multi-state study. We have about 30 varieties of alfalfa planted in between rows of intermediate wheatgrass in Wisconsin, Kansas, and Minnesota. Really trying to see, these varieties are really divergent, entries are really divergent. We have branching root systems, tap root systems, really quick regrowth, etc. Are there certain traits that are correlated with this system? And maybe are there certain varieties that we can already recommend to farmers to adopt this system? Because Kernza intermediate wheatgrass is in this early stage of pre-commercialization, and farmers are beginning to plant it. It would be great if we could, have farmers start planting this in a cropping system in a way that we, know long-term is where we should be moving. And so we started designing a cropping system, and this is how we're running it at the moment. So both of them are perennials. They both produce a lot of biomass. And in late April, early May, depending where you're at, the alfalfa almost begins to flower the first time, depending where you're at. And the intermediate wheatgrass has grown as well. And so you can actually have a grazing event or a forage harvest here just before this onset of tiller elongation. And last year, our trials in Kansas, we were producing 1.5 or so tons of really high quality dry matter at that time. After this forage harvest, we left to let it go. And the alfalfa is going to start flowering again in late May, early June. But because it's between rows, we can't really harvest it. And at this time, the intermediate wheatgrass really starts closing up the canopy. And so when we look at the alfalfa, we're actually declining in biomass continually from about this, May, June transition until we ultimately have mature seed that we're harvesting from the intermediate wheatgrass here. And at the end, we have residue that we can once again graze or bale. And so at this cutting last year, we were averaging about 4.5 tons dry matter in our plots. That's not nearly as good quality of hay, but it would be fine as grinding forage for heifer diets or beef diets. After that, it starts regrowing again. And so by the middle of September, we can take a third cutting, a third harvest, or a third grazing event where we're going to produce another 1-2 tons. And so our grain harvests are respectable. Last year, we were in the 700 or so pounds of seed yield per acre. But we also are producing between 6 and 7 tons of dry matter. And so it's really this dual system that we can imagine farmers adopting, hopefully very quickly, especially in Kansas, where we still have a tradition of having these warm season pastures that farmers most farmers still own a small herd of cattle. And so, we're generally buying feed and hay and feeding hay in this period of time. And so, stretching it out and reducing the hay we need to buy at this time before we move to our warm season pastures in the middle of May would be a great benefit. And then once our warm season pastures start declining in productivity, we can move them back to our cool season grass legume mixture here. And depending how many fields we have, we can bulk residue and graze throughout the winter. So it really fits nicely into our system. We're also looking at Cura clover. And so Abby Hahn is here with me. She's a research resident at the Land Institute. And we're really starting to begin to understand, what is controlling the compatibility in this system, especially with maize and with intermediate wheatgrass. And so we have a project. We've planted out all the accessions in the USDA. We're characterizing really well using some interesting morphometric approaches for leaf size and area and shape and color. When we look at white clover research, when they're using it in mixtures with grasses, the leaf color and the leaf shape and size and really makes a difference in the competitiveness of the Cura clover. And in Kansas, we really noticed this. So there's these clovers that have sort of a bluish color, and that's really a waxy coating on the leaves that's really preventing water losses in the system. And those ones seem to perform really well in our area. So finally, how do we develop a breeding program? And so this has been a very fun experiment for me to start from nothing. And so, the first year we're asking questions like, what pieces of equipment do we have that we can plant these things? Or how do I get the seeds out of the pods of my alfalfa plants? How do I harvest my lupin seeds before they all shatter and fall on the ground so I can measure yields? Or should I not measure yields? Should I just measure after everything's shattered as a way to find ones that are indehiscent? And then also, because we don't have an idiotype, how do we do breeding on the fly, right? How are we going to develop an idiotype in advanced populations when we don't know what to select for, while we're still doing the agronomic work to figure out what the cropping system is and how it should function? And so this has been an interesting experience for me. And when you think about a typical forage legume system, we want to look at yields for 2, 3, 4 years in a row before we really make our selections, because we want this long-term yield stability. And so this is what I've started doing. This is just a Cura clover example. We're really starting to do this with the 5 species that I mentioned: alfalfa, Cura clover, lupins, sainfoin, and alfalfa again as a grain. So, we're starting with maybe 100 selected plants here and making a polycross in the greenhouse in the late fall. We did this last November. And as we're moving into, the beginning of year 2, or, it's kind of year 1, but we harvest the seeds from those polycrosses, and maybe I want to plant 100 seeds. So I have 10,000 total progeny that I'm going to evaluate. That's a lot of plants to evaluate. And so we're going to do some selection here. We're going to select vigorous seedlings that haven't succumbed to diseases in the greenhouse, specifically inoculating them for traits like Aphanomyces 2 resistance, which is a seedling disease in our area. In the spring, we're just started doing this. Abby's been potting plants in the greenhouse, so we're going to try to pot as many of these seedlings as we can, so about 2,500. We're going to go through another polycross here to produce new half-sib seed families, basically, or grand sib families. And we want to be able to plant swords in the field. So this is typical kind of forage research. We want to go to swords so that we can evaluate on a whole plot basis. And we don't expect that many of them to actually produce enough seed to plant in swords. So we further reduce our entry number by selecting the top seed yielders here. And eventually, we're going to plant them in plots in the field, intercropped with a species, intermediate wheatgrass if they're there, or maybe in monocultures for the grains. At the beginning of our second year, this would be the fall of 2019, this fall. And hopefully we have enough plants that actually produce seed to make 2 plots that we can use some sort of partially replicated design instead of having to use check varieties. And as we move into our beginning of our 3rd year here, we're starting to, in the spring, have our first spring grazing simulation, like I showed you in that first, our cropping system design. We're going to have a summer grazing harvest and another fall grazing here. And we'll go through that iteration 3 times. These plants are planted in monocultures, space plants, and we're going to really evaluate, things like leaf area, regrowth rate, fall dormancy, and a variety of characteristics that we can also use. And at the end of it, we can select our top 1% of our plants. And at the same time, we're learning about our system. We're learning, is this viable? Are there certain traits that are better adapted to this system? And really developing our idiotype through this process. Hopefully starting in 2022, I guess fall 2021, we'll take those 100 plants that we selected and begin moving towards a genomic selection procedure. We'll start the same way with 100 seeds, harvest the seeds and plant those 10,000 seedlings out. But ultimately begin selecting our 100 progeny each year based on a genomic prediction model that we had developed previously. So we're designing an idiotype, we're learning about the plants, we're phenotyping all these things at the same time as we go. And splitting off into additional cycles. So instead of having a 5-year cycle, I'm now on a 1-year cycle. But I'll take a portion of these plants that will become my next training population. And so over time, basically, I have about 500 plots at my 1-year age group, my 2-year age group, and the 3-year age group of plants in the field that we're continually cycling through. And we didn't pick a species yet. Remember, we have 5 species. So at the same time, we're trying to select species. And so this is really a way to compare effectiveness in a cropping system, ability in the future to maybe perform as a grain crop all simultaneously. And Abby's starting to develop some genomic tools for these species where, like Cure Clover, doesn't have markers or a linkage map or anything yet. And so we're developing a linkage map using Capture-Seq from Rapid Genomics, while also at the same time, eventually we'll make a targeted sequencing panel from the linkage map, choosing markers randomly distributed across those linkage groups to make a targeted panel for the genotype of the training population and eventually in these genomic selection models. And so that's what I'm doing. If you have any questions, I'd like to hear them. Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation. I was wondering how long you envision the alfalfa to be present in an intercrop system like that. It seems like the intermediate wheatgrass could outlast the alfalfa by quite a bit. So, just wondering what you had in mind.
Yeah. So far, what we've observed in intermediate wheatgrass is that we have declining yields after the 2nd, 3rd year, and depending where you're at, is going to determine how long that crop system is going to be a part of your rotation. So it might not have to be more than 4 or 5 years. The one nice thing about the way we're imagining it is that we allow time for accumulation of carbohydrates in the root crowns to increase the persistence of our alfalfa over time. And so we hope that it's going to stay there. And by not actively cutting it the 5 times that we would in a normal year, that's going to help with the system a little bit. And obviously persistence is part of the selection procedure. So that's why we're really measuring 3 years of phenotypic data before we make selections, so that we're making sure that we select plants that are really performing in that way. And things like Cura clover, for example, could be a better candidate, and we haven't really chosen yet. Cura clover has this rhizomatous growth. It's extremely persistent, and it might stay there longer in the system. But Kernza and Cura clover both have these really fibrous above ground root systems that may end up competing more. We don't really know. That might also, allow for this interaction and nitrogen transfer to occur. But we're learning that through the breeding at the same time. So, yep.
Hey, Brandon. Do you expect genotypic variability for the ability to cooperate with the other species in your intercropping?
Yeah, so that was one of the goals for this sort of pre-breeding, plant these other varieties in the system. So right now we have about 30 varieties planted of alfalfa, at least, with intermediate wheatgrass around the country. Hoping to see, is there genetic and phenotypic variation? Does the Kearns or intermediate wheatgrass respond differently when you plant different varieties between it? So that's like the first experiment, right? If we use the most divergent phenotypic variation that we have in varieties in that experiment and there's no difference, maybe we have to go the opposite direction. Maybe there's something we need to be selecting for in intermediate wheatgrass. But so far we've observed quite a bit of variation, and we think breeding is going to work. And so, at least for adaptation to climates. So in Wisconsin, the alfalfa was outcompeting, in Wisconsin and Minnesota both, the alfalfa was outcompeting the intermediate wheatgrass quite a bit in the establishment year. In Kansas, it was the opposite. So if we look at like biomass ratios, the alfalfa to intermediate wheatgrass biomass ratio is like 2-to-1 in Wisconsin and like 1-to-2 in Kansas. And so it's the exact opposite. And if we go further and try to figure out, okay, what is it about these varieties that's causing that? Fall dormancy seems to be key. So in alfalfa, we have this ranges of fall dormancy that are, we expect, controlled by photoperiod sensitivity. And so they're going to start growing at a certain time of the year. And grasses have some photoperiod sensitivity, but they're also more growing degree dependent. And so we accumulate growing degree days and photoperiod differently in both environments. So we can imagine at some point in time, making sure we overlap the phenology of those two things just right so that we can reduce competition or increase compatibility, however you want to look at it.
So this is really related to what you were just talking about, is that what about undesirable species? Since you're not tilling, what about weeds, nut grass, all these other kinds of things that incur in crop fields?
Yeah, so far what we've seen, that's a pretty big problem the first year of our establishment. But most of the weeds, when we think about them in our cropping systems right now, are also annuals that are adapted to using all the resources really quickly and growing really quickly in these early successional ecosystems. And so what we're finding to some extent is that when you put a big perennial grass there and these other perennial legume species, especially the rhizomatous ones, they outcompete the weeds fairly quickly as we move up this successional gradient in our cropping system. We're going to have problems with things like trees and with things like other, perennial species that don't really take hold in our cropping systems the way we grow them right now. But we haven't had problems with, like the Palmer amaranths and the things like that after the first year. And so we don't know what's going to happen, right? This is the new frontier. So we can think about continuing to go along paths or to explore things that we've overlooked as humans for the last 10,000 years. We've kind of overlooked this idea of having perennial grain crops, and it's somewhere that when we see how things function in our Earth systems right now, that we need to begin exploring in more detail.
So I think the perennial lupin idea is kind of interesting. I know that for annual lupin production, there's issues with anti-nutritionals. So if you're looking at lupins, is this something you would want to look at sooner rather than later because it's such a big potential roadblock to grain usage?
Yeah, so we are starting collaborations. My little circle diagram I was showing you, we're actually phenotyping. We're doing some mass spec work to look at the alkaloid profile. So there's alkaloids in lupins that are toxic to mammals and other things one of the things that's really interesting about it, so we had 3 species of lupins that were domesticated and eaten for thousands of years with the alkaloids. There was always most of them are water soluble and heat sensitive, and so there was a processing step to removing the alkaloids, and they were kind of nice to have there because they provide sort of anti-herbivory in those cropping systems. And we've now used mutagenesis 3 times and removed the alkaloid biosynthesis pathway, basically. It doesn't function anymore. And the lupins that we're cultivating now, especially in Australia, so all the lupins in Australia are non-bitter types, the sweet types, they don't produce alkaloids. In Europe, we still have a lot of the bitter types that are grown. And so if you buy like lupini beans in Italy or in Palestine, where I just were, those are all actually soaked for multiple days before they're fed to you. So that's a really good question to think about. I'm starting breeding potential new species. Is it something that I should get rid of, or is that something that I should take advantage of in designing this crop? And what sort of food system do you need to have to control that? And so in Australia, they have a law that you can only have the non-bitter types because they don't want anyone to, have the chance of eating something that is high in alkaloids. In Europe, there's no laws, and so everything has to be processed this kind of the same way, treated like they might have alkaloids in them. And there's all these fascinating things, like when we talk about high-value products, alkaloids are important for medicinal uses and et cetera. And so there might be a whole industries about actually taking the alkaloids out of the lupins and using them as a secondary product and using the proteins for human consumption.
Other questions? Do we have one on Zoom? Okay, we have a question from Chris Smallwood. Oh, sorry. Which one? Here. What are some challenges you face with product development using these perennial crops, and what are some successes you've had?
Yeah, so we've done no product development so far. And this is because I'm still trying to decide what we're going to do with it. But we have been doing product development for other grains at the Land Institute. So intermediate wheatgrass is in this pre-commercialization stage under the name, the grain sold under the name Kernza. And we just hired a commercialization manager to oversee that process. And so far there's way more demand than supply available. So we're in this unique state of time where there's so much demand that we can't produce enough seed for farmers to plant because we're trying to have income to support the research and et cetera by selling the grain to people to eat. So hopefully what we imagine is that people begin valuing, like the plant-based proteins that we were talking about, people begin valuing things because of the impact that they have on our environment. People can pay a premium for those things in the future. We need to do a whole lot of food safety research before I can release anything. So the current intermediate wheatgrass has gone through iterative rounds of applying for these kind of generally regarded as safe ingredients so that they can be registered for use in the US. Alfalfa is a really nice candidate also, and lupins are because there's already lupins there, so they already have some of those statuses, which hopefully helps someday in that process.
Any other questions? I have a question.
Yeah.
Thinking about sort of how you might transition from annual systems to these more diverse perennial systems, how do you think is the best strategy to go about that? What sort of compromises are you willing to make? And what are you trying to maybe leverage in doing so?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that we're pushing towards these kind of dual use, forage grain systems, is that we are compromising right now, releasing intermediate wheatgrass as a grain crop. We're not going to achieve the same yields as wheat. We can, producing respectable amounts if there's a premium value for the grain is one way to move in that direction. And one of the compromises we're going to make is probably in the amount of productivity. And this is just the way it is, right? So if we think about wheat, it's got like a 10,000 year head start. We need to envision, right, 2050 is this number that we throw out about how are we going to feed people in 2050, but we also need to think about feeding people in 2100 and 2150. And what are we going to do to solve these problems that are pressing right now? We already have upset biogeochemical systems in the US. We need to start thinking about those problems as well. And so if I don't release something, if there's no perennial legume crop in the next 10 years, I don't know if that's a problem. We really need them at some point in time, and someone needs to start working on them. And it definitely has to not be a me. It's got to be a we. Like we know that there's no chance that any of these perennial legume species can exist, or perennial grain crops, et cetera, without having a larger, scientific, public and private interest and investment in the development of these crops. So.
Okay, with that, let's thank Brandon again.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.